Do you need a fast crossbow? That's this episode of Death by Bunjie. Bunjie here is a 2010 Excalibur Axiom crossbow. Bunjie shoots about 305 feet per second on a good day, downhill. Not that that makes any difference, but basically it is a 305 feet per second crossbow. Every year I'm tempted by these new crossbows. Do I want to step up to a faster crossbow? And I get that question a lot. When are you going to upgrade? When are you going to get a faster crossbow? And generally speaking, the answer I think is, that I always give, is that I am not going to upgrade. I'm happy with the crossbow that I have, and I don't think you necessarily need a fast crossbow to enjoy crossbow hunting. Keep in mind that Bunjie at 305 feet per second is fast by historical standards, maybe not modern day standards where we're shooting 400 feet per second pretty regularly with these crossbows, but by historical standards, Bunjie is very fast. American Indians were running around shooting deer at 100 feet per second, 150 feet per second perhaps. Fred Bear, the father of modern day archery, probably never shot a compound bow that shot faster than 250 feet per second. So by historical standards, 300 feet per second is pretty fast. Now, I am certainly not knocking anyone who has a fast crossbow. I am not knocking any manufacturer who makes those fast crossbows. Improvements in technology are important, and I'm glad that they are working on technology to improve crossbows. But I just don't want to discourage people from hunting with their maybe older, maybe slower crossbows. Because in the end, I've said this before on here, I think accuracy is the number one factor, the number one thing we're looking for when we're crossbow hunting. Accuracy is number one with crossbows. One of the first things we talk about when we talk about fast crossbows and the need for speed is whether the deer will jump the string. Now, essentially what that means is a deer that's alert, a deer that is broadside, a deer that is presenting you with a nice shot. When a deer hears the shot, what's the deer going to do? It's going to crouch down and prepare its legs to spring away. So as it's crouching down to generate that momentum from its legs and get those legs ready to spring so it can run away, as it's doing that, the deer will drop, and that will affect your shot. In other words, the arrow's on its way. By the time the arrow gets there, the deer has dropped slightly, and you're hitting higher than what you expected. Now, it's not going to happen with a rifle, like a 270 that travels over 3,000 feet per second. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen with even a 22 that is faster than the speed of sound. In other words, that bullet is getting there before the sound can possibly get there. It travels faster than the speed of sound. With archery equipment, compound bows, recurve bows, or crossbows, we are much, much slower than the speed of sound. The speed of sound, 1,125 feet per second. Fastest crossbows on the market, somewhere around 400 feet per second. So we're about 1/3 the speed of sound. The sound is actually going to get to that deer before the arrow does. So that's important to keep in mind, and that's the concept of jumping the string. Essentially, the deer reacts before the arrow gets there. In the interest of full disclosure, I have taken about 24 shots on deer with this crossbow. I've recovered all but a few of those deer. There's been a handful that I did not recover, and I'll do another video this fall talking about that subject, talking about how to deal with losing a deer. But out of all the deer that I've shot at, in approximately 24 shots, only 2 have jumped the string noticeably before the arrow arrived. And both of those I have on tape. One of those is a video of a doe that I shot down here in the well pad food plot. That deer jumped the string, I spined that doe, and you can watch that video here on YouTube. I am going to upload a video of me shooting a deer down here behind me down in the buck field. That deer tremendously jumped the string. That's a really, really good example of it that I had on tape, one of the first crossbow kills that I had. So go ahead and watch those videos for examples of jumping the string. So that's one of the reasons that we have this quest for faster crossbows, is to prevent that from happening. But I can tell you that I videotaped all of these encounters with deer, and if only 2 of them out of 24 have jumped the string noticeably before the arrow arrives, then really is that an issue that's less than 10%? I can take less than 10% of my deer dropping slightly before the arrow gets there. Because if it's only affecting less than 10% of the shots, 1 in 10, 1 in 12 shots, that's not enough reason for me to go out and invest in more expensive equipment and replace equipment that is working well over 90% of the time perfectly. And I want to be clear also, in both of those instances where the deer jumped the string, I recovered both of those deer. Now, the other thing when we talk about jumping the string is, sometimes I think this is a built-in excuse that we as archers might use to sort of justify not recovering a deer, justify taking a bad shot. If you take a shot on a deer, all deer are going to jump when they feel the contact with that arrow. All deer are going to react to that. As they're dropping down, they all drop down and run away. Every one of them that you shoot. Without filming it, without being able to see that arrow and tell when you shoot and when the arrow arrives and being able to slow it down in your computer, without doing that, you really can't say that the deer really jumped the string. Unless you have proof of it, because they all appear to jump the string. All of them do. Every one of them. Unless you spine them and they just tip over. So keep that in mind. I mean, let's correct our problems. The only way to get better at this stuff is to be honest about what the issues are, what the potential problems are, and address those appropriately. Faster crossbow, is it really going to make that much difference? Another reason people talk about speed and want faster crossbows is because they want to generate more energy and get more damage done with their crossbows, with their arrows, as the arrow hits the deer or other game. I don't think that is a big consideration. At least to me, it is not a big enough consideration to go forward and buy a faster crossbow. There is not a single instance where I have failed to get a pass-through with this crossbow at 305 feet per second in a case where I took a good shot on a deer. Now, this crossbow is not going to pass through the deer's shoulder blade. It's not going to do it. If you shoot a deer head on and you're trying to penetrate the rib cage, the brisket up front, there's too much deer there, you're not going to get a pass-through necessarily with that. You might be able to kill a deer that way, but I don't think that's a good shot to take. But on any good shot, if you wait for the proper broadside shot, preferably slightly quartering away, you will get a pass-through with this crossbow at 305 feet per second. You can't get more of a pass-through at 400 feet per second. It doesn't make any difference. It's just going to speed up the arrow, and really, it's just going to bury the arrow further in the dirt on the other side. When I shoot a deer at 10, 15 yards, 20 yards, I get a pass-through from a tree stand. I stick the arrow in the dirt usually. So I have to go pull the arrow out of the dirt. I don't need more speed or more power than that. You can't get more of a pass-through. Okay. If you're hunting bigger game, that might make a difference. But I am told in one little research I did on the subject, and this may happen someday, Bunjie here has enough energy to pass through an elk. So I should be able to hunt elk, a really big serpent, a really big deer, with this crossbow. So speed is not necessarily going to improve that penetration. It's certainly going to penetrate farther, but on a good shot, it's going to get a pass through anyway. The other thing I want to mention about speed is when you look at the crossbow speeds in catalogs, online, or what have you, the arrow speed that they're talking about is the speed of the arrow leaving the rail. It's the speed of the arrow immediately after it leaves the crossbow. They have a chronograph set up in front of the crossbow and they're shooting through that. That arrow reaches its maximum speed the minute it leaves the crossbow. That speed only goes down after you pull the trigger. The farther it goes, it drops significantly in speed. Go ahead and get online and go find one of these websites. I'll put links in the description. If you go to that, you can type in the speed of your crossbow. The speed that your manufacturer tells you is the speed that that crossbow is supposed to shoot at. Type in that number along with the arrows that you use, both the weight, the grains, and also the length of the veins, the height of the veins, all that sort of thing. And you'll be quite surprised at the differences. Okay, I've taken a break, come inside, and we're going to look things over on the computer. This is what I was telling you about. I'm going to show you a couple of the websites that I'm talking about when we're talking about calculating arrow speed and how speed is affected by your crossbow and by your arrow's weight and by the distance that you're shooting, all that sort of thing. I'm going to take you first. If you look around, there are a number of different websites you can visit. If you are an Excalibur user like me, Excalibur on their website has a page set up showing arrow drop, terminal velocity, kinetic energy, and all the things that are affected by by arrows and by feet per second over distance. There's a nice little website up there with nice little graphs. You can check that out. Look at your manufacturer's website. They may have similar information. There's lots and lots of other sources. But the sites that I'm talking about are ones like this one right here from bestcrossbowsource.com. If you look at that website, they have an arrow ballistics calculator on their website. And I really enjoy playing around with this. And I've seen this before years ago, but I came back to it now that I was doing this video when I was thinking about this subject again. If you go in there, you can type in your arrow speed. In my case, Bunjie is the 305 feet per second crossbow, so I typed in 305 feet per second. Type in your arrow weight. I typed in 370 because I'm using a 265 grain arrow. The Excalibur Firebolt is what I use from Easton Arrows, I guess is the company that makes it. But I'm using those carbon arrows. Those are 265 grains. There's an extra 5 grains or so from the Luminoc that puts me up to 270. And I use the Exact broadhead. That's a 100 grain broadhead. So the total arrow rig that we're talking about here is 370 grains. And that's what I typed in there. Fletching length 4 inches on those arrows. Fletching height is just under ½ an inch, so I typed in, actually was set by default at 0.45 inches, so I left it there with the default setting. And lastly, the shaft length 20 inches. So that one, I typed in those numbers, hit the calculate ballistics button, press that button, and it gives you a calculation, if you look at it, of how mathematically your arrow would perform. Now this takes into effect gravity. It does not take into effect, obviously, wind or wind speed. If you're shooting into the wind, it's going to make a difference with your arrow. You're shooting against the wind, you're shooting across the wind, through the wind. All of that affects arrow speed and accuracy. You shouldn't be shooting at animals in heavy wind. Wind is not your friend when you are hunting with a crossbow, so we don't shoot in wind. But all conditions, nice calm conditions, this is the way your arrows will perform, at least mathematically. This is what science tells us. You can get into this kind of stuff and understand the science behind it, understand the math behind it if you want to. I do not like doing that. That's why I look for little websites like this that set up and give you that information, because I really don't like doing that kind of math. But anyway, the important thing that I wanted to point out with regard to this video is the difference in arrow speed. Now, I start at 0 yards at 305 feet per second. That means I pull the trigger and the arrow leaves the rail at 305 feet per second. It only goes down from there. I want to point that out. If you look, we're going at 301 feet per second, 296 feet per second at 20 yards, down to at 30 yards, that arrow is traveling 292 feet per second. The important takeaway here is there's a difference between shooting a deer at 10 yards and shooting a deer at 50 yards in terms of the speed of your arrow. Now, I've got some other notes that I scratched out here. You don't need a fancy website to go ahead and calculate this stuff. You can use a little calculator, just a little desktop calculator, to calculate some interesting stuff. Now, this isn't 100% accurate, but it gives you a good idea of the point I'm trying to make about speed and how speed is not a cure-all for all of your crossbow ills. It is not a way to cover up for inaccurate shots. You still need to make accurate shots and take good shots. And the reason I say that is, what I've done is I've scratched out here and done a little bit of math, but on a 300 feet per second crossbow, that means we're shooting 300 feet in 1 second. How long does it take us for that arrow to travel 20 yards or 60 feet. 20 yards times 3 would be 60 feet. Now, first of all, this is a little bit of a misnomer. When you say 300 feet per second, it sounds like our arrow is going to travel the length of a football field in 1 second, and that's not entirely true. We know that from this ballistics calculator, for example, that as our arrow goes down that football field, if we were to shoot the entire length of a football field, by the time it gets to the end of the football field, it's traveling less than 300 feet per second. So it's traveling considerably slower. Now, so that means this number does not take that into account. But if I do this math and divide all of this stuff out, divide 60 by 300, and what do we end up with? 0.2. That means that for our arrow to travel at 300 feet per second, to travel only 60 feet or 20 yards, it's taking us 0.2 of a second for our arrow to get there. Now, I know what you're going to say. Well, first of all, it actually takes a little bit longer than 2/10 of a second. That number isn't 100% accurate because the arrow is losing speed every yard, okay? But for our purposes here to illustrate this, 2/10 of a second to travel 60 feet or 20 yards with my crossbow, with a 300 feet per second crossbow. Look at the difference though, if you're shooting a 400 foot per second crossbow. We got 400 over 1 equals 60 over x, 60 being the 60 feet or 20 yards. If we divide 400, the 60 by 400, we end up with 0.15. X equals 0.15. That means that a 400 foot per second crossbow is going to shoot an arrow over a 20 yard span 0.15 seconds. 15 hundredths of a second instead of 2/10 of a second. So you've saved yourself 0.05. That's the difference, with a 400 foot per second crossbow instead of a 300 foot per second crossbow. You might be thinking that the 400 feet per second crossbow, yeah, it's going to lose speed over the distance, but it's going faster, so it's not going to lose speed as quickly. That's not true. In fact, if you go to that Best Crossbow Source website, they have a separate chart on here, separate page dedicated to the question of arrow speed drop crossbow test results. The arrow speed drop, if you look at that, actually shows that yes, you start out at 400, you drop down over time. You start at 300, you drop down over time. They both drop down, but they actually, if you look at that chart, they actually drop down at the same rate. You don't gain any advantage by having a faster crossbow in terms of how fast your arrow loses its velocity. Really, the point I'm trying to make here is there's a diminishing return on this. At some point, I suppose if we were shooting 1,000 feet per second with a crossbow, that would make a huge difference, and that would be something that would be worth spending lots and lots of more money on. That would be something that would be worth upgrading your crossbow on and all that sort of thing. That might make a difference, but the reality is we are nowhere near that. I think there is a diminishing return in terms of crossbow speed. And the reason I say that is, if you look at the difference between the 300 foot and the 400 foot per second crossbow over 20 yards, it's 0.15 versus 0.2. That's a difference of 0.05 or 5/100ths of a second. 5/100ths of a second, 5%. You gain, by going up 100 feet per second, you only gain 5% difference in speed. 5/100ths of a second. And that's, again, that's the basic math to illustrate the point. It's not exactly the correct math because other factors like wind are going to take an effect, that sort of thing, and the arrows that lose speed over time would have an effect. But essentially, that diminishing return is going to apply. So I don't know that there's that much improvement if you increase the speed. And you might be thinking, well, what about longer shots? It's going to make a difference there. But I did the math on that real quick too. On a 40-yard shot, your 300 feet per second crossbow is going to travel that 40 yards, which is 120 feet. We're going to do the math on that. 40 yards, 120 feet. It will travel that 40 yards in 0.4 seconds. On the other hand, your 400 feet per second crossbow is going to travel that 40 yards in 0.3 seconds. So there's a difference of 0.1 second, or 1/10 of a second over 40 yards. 1/10 of a second. That is 5/100ths of a second improvement over 20 yards, or 1/10 of a second of improvement over 40 yards by going from 300 to 400 feet per second. Not enough of an increase. And really what it comes down to for me, to summarize all this stuff, is this. If your shot on a deer or any other animal comes down to 0.05 difference, 5/100ths of a second, if it comes down to that, you're probably doing something wrong. It really shouldn't come down to anything that close. Shouldn't even be close. 1/10 of a second shouldn't make any difference to you or the deer in the end. An accurate shot, 1/10 of a second is not going to make any difference. Keep the shots short, keep them accurate. You won't have any problem recovering deer with your crossbow. Now again, I am not trying to discourage people from buying fast crossbows whatsoever. I am not trying to discourage that, and I'm not trying to knock on anybody or any crossbow that happens to be pretty fast. That's awesome. Not doing that. But the other thing I want you to keep in mind when we're talking about crossbows and speed is, speed can create some problems with arrow flight. It has been a challenge for the manufacturers to get over that 350 feet per second mark. All of the manufacturers, not just Excalibur, but they had problems with their limbs. A lot of different manufacturers did with the faster crossbows. And the other problem that you have is you have problems with accuracy sometimes when you are trying to shoot faster. The exact same thing went on with the compound bow hunters. If you look back at history, when they were trying to hit that 300 feet per second mark with compound bows, they ran into a lot of problems. Now they're doing fantastic. Like I said, technology needs to improve. There's no question about that. But one of the problems that they run into with speed is the faster those crossbows get, the more room there is for error. In fact, if you look at Excalibur, for example, and I have experience primarily with my Excalibur crossbow, but it comes with a green string, a fast flight string. That's just their standard string that they put on their crossbows. I've upgraded this to the Dynaflight Flemish string. It increases the speed a little bit. Putting it on here, I didn't have any trouble. I've had accurate shots, no problem, okay, with that string. But one of the things Excalibur will tell you, if you're having problems maintaining accuracy, you can go back to the green string, slow down the speed of your crossbow, and it will put you back and give you more consistent accuracy. Consistent accuracy is more important to me than speed. If I were having trouble with that consistent accuracy out to 30 yards, then I would go back to the other string. However, I'm not having a problem with accuracy. I'm, for the most part, very happy with this, the way it's performing at this time. It's just something to consider. If you're having problems with accuracy, you might want to slow your crossbow down a little bit. This is not a channel about getting into all the little technical details and doing the math and all that sort of thing. I don't do that. What I do is I look at the generalities, I look at the big picture of what I'm trying to accomplish. What I'm trying to accomplish when I go out in the woods with my crossbow is have a great time enjoying the outdoors and shoot some deer and hopefully bring home some venison for the freezer, get a shot someday at a big trophy buck, that sort of thing. That's what the crossbow does extremely well. We can get hung up on speed, and if you have a fast crossbow, that's awesome. They're awesome, there's no question. But don't get hung up on that speed. Let's focus on the big picture, which is go out there, make sure this thing's accurate, only take good shots, and you won't have any problem with your crossbow. So give me your thoughts on crossbow speed. Is it significant? Is it very, very important to you to have a fast crossbow, or are you happy with the speed of your crossbow? Let me know in the comments what you think about that. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you like crossbow videos and outdoor related videos, please subscribe. Like the Facebook page too if you haven't done so already. And until next time, all hail Bunjie! The second state is #1 in my book.